Monsters invading New York City, lightsaber battles in the cold heart of space. Using visual effects like these, filmmakers bring their vision to life to create experiences that we can only dream of. But where did it begin? Let me take you back. This is the history of visual effects. The story of visual effects starts all the way back in 1895 with a Paris-born man named Georges Méliès set on a path to success. Starting off with a fascination for theater, Méliès took that knowledge and applied it to the newly developing world of filmmaking. After buying a new machine used for projecting animations, he began to experiment with it, and though it was hard, he worked on the machine and turned it into one of the earliest functioning film cameras. A few years later, he got his hands on multiple new, better cameras as soon as the technology was available to him. Méliès started strong, shooting his first film in May 1896, and didn't stop. Méliès used stage tricks that could be used on plays, drawing from his experience in theater, but he didn't even stop there. He discovered basic film tricks and special effects that are still used today, like in his most famous project, Le Voyage de la Lune, combining practical tricks and animation to bring incredible visions to life. He created so many effects that are still used today. For instance, he used what's called a multiple exposure, where you expose a piece of film multiple times in different ways to place 7 different characters all in the same shot. He also found out one of the most important visual effects tricks of all time, called the stop trick. When his camera jammed one day, he found out that you could stop the film, then change what's in the scene to create the effect of something appearing, which would go on to be used in thousands of movies and TV shows. Méliès made films from 1896 to 1913, developing over 500 films in his time, and pioneered the future of visual effects. In 1933, Radio Pictures shocked the world with King Kong, one of the first stop-motion feature films in the world. Implementing scaled-down miniatures, metal skeletons, and a wide variety of other special effects, King Kong demonstrated the true prowess of visual effects at the time, and while by modern standards the stop-motion looks kinda choppy, the terror of Kong still shines through. The director, Willis O'Brien, worked with his crew to create some truly stunning scenes, even without much reference back then. This movie really pioneered a lot of visual tricks, like stop-motion in a wider format, using double exposure to put Kong in a scene with human actors, and even to project images behind an actor for certain shots. This was really when the world began to see the true scope of what visual effects could bring to life, but it didn't stop there. From then on, groundbreaking visual effects kept coming, from 1940's Thief of Baghdad to 1956's 10 Commandments. It wasn't until the 1960s, though, that the true scope of visual effects began to be realized. 1968 brought one of the coolest movies to use visual effects in the 20th century. 2001: A Space Odyssey, directed by Stanley Kubrick, brought one of the most realistic depictions of space of all time. From the effect of a pen floating in midair by using clear glass to mounting a camera in a spinning room, 2001 broke incredible ground in how visual effects were made. And that's not even mentioning arguably 2001's most famous scene, this psychedelic trip towards the end of the movie. By leaving the camera shutter open and only showing the camera a small amount of light from a projected screen, they were able to create this brilliant effect. This movie showed that with enough ingenuity and creativity, you can create something stunning. And visual effects just kept getting better from here, leading up to one of the most iconic trilogies of all time, Star Wars. In 1977, the world was forever changed by the release of George Lucas's creation, Star Wars. This movie was one of the most influential of the 70s, and used some incredible techniques. For instance, the filmmakers used techniques like putting miniature models in front of a blue screen, then using a robotic camera to perform the same motion over and over again, so you could have multiple pieces of footage overlaid seamlessly, like this shot here. First, they'd shoot this ship on a blue screen using a robotic camera, then shoot this one separately, but because they used a robotic camera that repeated the motion, the camera did the same thing over and over again, so it looks like they're in the same scene together. They even cut out film by hands for lightsabers, shining through the cut film to expose the new film and create its unique effect. Each film following integrated something new, and set the stage for the rest of the 20th century when it came to visual effects. But while Star Wars was shot entirely in real life, the 80s brought an entirely new development for film and visual effects technology: computers. Up until this point, computers being used for visual effects have been limited to a cube in 3D, but TRON brought something incredible in 1982: 3D animation. TRON marked a new era for visual effects. At the time, computer animation was at its infancy. TRON took it to a whole new level. We tend to think of animation now as keyframes, where characters go from one point to the next based on inputs an animator gives. But back then, it had to be done with math. Animators had to figure out the movement that they wanted, then plug in the exact math for that image to show up in the 3D program, for every frame of animation. And at 24 frames per second, it was incredibly ambitious. Even though it hasn't aged as well as other films, this was pretty much the first movie to incorporate CGI at this level. And though companies probably wouldn't make a movie like this today, the look of the movie can be chalked up to a style, so it's almost ageless. This set up using computers for visual effects, but it wasn't until 3 years later until we reached the next step: a CGI character. You wouldn't expect such a huge visual effects development on an $18 million budget, adjusted today to around $50 million, but it was. Young Sherlock Holmes brought to life a pane of stained glass to fight, and while it's not perfect, for the first computer-generated character, it looks incredible, and was perfect by 80s standards. It's incredible. It's a seamless effect that still holds up today, even though they had to use the same system in TRON, typing in math. The shadows that you see had to be hand-drawn back then. It's incredible what artists had to do to create this kind of effect, but the hard work shows. This was groundbreaking in every way for the visual effects industry, and spawned a ton of future movies with 3D characters. Now we jump into the 90s, and while a few years earlier we had a revolutionary Terminator movie, Terminator 2 is remembered to have some of the coolest visual effects of the 90s, and builds a lot on the fairly new advent of computer-generated characters. ILM, or Industrial Lights and Magic, pioneered the art of what's commonly known as morphing. By distorting an image and fading between two shots, you could create the effect of a morph, but that's just one of the many things they did on this movie. From the liquid metal effect to the makeup on the Terminators, this movie shows an absolute mastery of the art of visual effects, and set the bar for movies to come. And then, a movie hit that bar, in 1993, Jurassic Park. Jurassic Park's special effects department brought to life one of the most famous movies of all time. But it wasn't just incredible visuals. Because of the limits in technology back then, lighting scenes with a bunch of different lights ended up making the dinosaurs look unrealistic. So for this terrifying scene, the filmmakers only used one focused light and used the rain of the scene to sell the T-Rex's glossy look. They also built a 30-foot animatronic dinosaur, so if something was looking unrealistic, they could take a look at the real-life dinosaur model and tell how it would really look. This kind of practical filmmaking has become lost in today's day and age to some degree, but this movie shows just how powerful it can really be. This movie leads us into the 21st century, where computer-generated imagery became the main way of creating visual effects. Movies continue to be groundbreaking, from insane slow motion in The Matrix to Gollum in Lord of the Rings, and even to a completely computer-generated world in James Cameron's Avatar. Developments in visual effects have never become stagnant, and they keep growing today. But to this day, some of the best filmmakers recognize visual effects from the past, realizing that sometimes real-life, practical effects can feel more real than throwing actors in front of a green screen. Like in 2018's Mission Impossible Fallout, where Tom Cruise actually jumps out of a plane with a cameraman and does a real skydive. While some filmmakers opted to go completely computer generated, some of the best still harken back to history and what made those early visual effects work so well. The development of visual effects shows the true tenacity of filmmakers throughout the years to bring our dreams to life, from Iron Man to the Man on the Moon. This has been the abridged history of visual effects. Thanks so much for coming along.